So for this next program, we're going to be asking the user to enter a set of numbers. And then the program will be comparing these in the background to determine the greatest one amongst the ones that are entered. So it's going to evaluate that answer depending on the values that are entered on the spot, right? So let's deep dive into it. And we start with our preprocessor or our include statement, and that's going to be the IOStream module. So we're going to need this for two reasons. One, to output messages to the console log, and then also to read data that is entered from the user. So we're extracting that data from the console. The next one is going to be our namespace declaration. So again, that's really important just to let the compiler know which set of unique words we're going to be using when we write our program, just so that our compiler understands where to look and basically to understand the dictionary that we'll be using in our code. So then we have our main function. And as I mentioned previously, this is important because you could have many functions in your program, and this is the first one that will get ran by the compiler. So in this case, we're not going to be adding any further functions, but everything will go inside. Okay, but it's basically the function that the compiler will go to first as a starting point. So when we're thinking about this scenario of we're asking the user to enter some numbers and then we compare them later, we start by thinking about, okay, where are we going to store that data? And we can actually define some variables for that. So this is what we have here. We have 4 integer variables, A, B, C. So A, B, C to store those numbers, and then max to store the greatest number. So we're storing the result of that comparison within the max variable. Okay, so then we have our first message to the user by using the cout object in here, and then the insertion operator. So that basically takes that data or information and it adds it to that cout object for it to be displayed in the console. Then we have our cin object to read in that data that the user enters, and our extraction operator to save that data within the A variable. So in here, these two lines, what we are doing is outputting that message to the user, hey, can you enter this? And then once they enter that data, we store it in a specific variable so we can refer to it later, or we can use it in a whole variety of ways. We repeat that process for the second number, we store that in B, and then for the third number, and we store that in C. So far, we've defined the variables that we're going to use to store the information that the user enters. Then we ask for that information and we store that information. So we've got all that data up until this point, and we can start processing it and actually making that comparison. And one way to do that, as you may have guessed, is using if statements. So we've got our first if statement here, and you start with if, and then you've got your condition that you're evaluating within a set of parentheses, right? So we have here A is higher than B. And if that's the case, that's going to be true. If not, that's going to be false. So you will get one of two outcomes there, right? If that's true, then the first statement will get executed and max will be set to the value of A. If that is not true, then you go on to the next statement, which is just an else statement. So else has no criteria attached to it, meaning that if for whatever reason this first scenario or criteria doesn't turn out to be true, doesn't get executed, we automatically go on to this else statement, and this will for sure get executed in the event that that first scenario doesn't take place. Okay, so with these 4 lines here, we are essentially determining which of the two is higher between A and B, right? So we've got that comparison done with, and we can move on to the next one, so which is dealing with C. So this if statement here just compares C to the current max. That could be A, that could be B, but it really doesn't matter up until this point. We just know that that's the max and that's really the number to beat. So if C can beat that number or is higher than that number, then you get a new max number assigned. So max would take the value of C, right? So with these two if statements, we've gone ahead and we've analyzed those numbers and we've determined which is the highest one of them all, and or the greatest one of them all, and it could be either A, B, or C. Now, one thing to note is that first if statement will always get evaluated, as well as this second if statement. The else part will only happen or will only get evaluated if this first scenario doesn't happen because it turns out to be false. So it will basically check, okay, is this true? Okay, if that's the case, then do that first statement, otherwise do that second statement. But then when you get to that second if statement, it will definitely evaluate this, okay? And it will say, okay, if this is true, then set max to C. Otherwise, if that's not true, this will not get evaluated and it will just do nothing because there's no further else statements that are following it. Another thing you could also think about when looking at this is the way that you write your if statement. So you could also add in some brackets, okay? And what this will allow you to do is, I mean, at first glance, if you just add the brackets, it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. That code will run and you get the same exact output regardless. But what these brackets allow you to do, besides maybe visualizing it a bit better, what's happening here, is you can add in a second or as many lines as you want. So for example, we could add a message that says A is greater than B. And rather than just having one statement executed, if this is true, you could have multiple statements within the body of that scenario. Essentially, you could do the same thing with else, and it's something that you might want to try if the syntax without the brackets seems too simplistic or it might be a bit confusing. Just picture those invisible brackets being there, or if you want, you can actually add them in yourself. It won't make a difference to your code execution. And then the last thing we're doing in this program is we're actually outputting the result, right? Because there's no point really in doing that comparison if the user cannot see what's happening or if they cannot get that result output on the screen. So we're just outputting a message with, again, C out, and this message will say the greater number is, and then print out the value of max. So let's see that in action here. Okay, here we go. So let's say we do 5, and then we can do 15 and 10. There you go. The greater number is 15, and that's been calculated using the if statements that we've been covering during session 4. That's it for program 2, guys.